Today. Today I want to talk a little bit about Douglas Winiarski's article regarding Jonathan Edwards as kind of a revival enthusiast. And everyone knows, most scholarship knows, that Edwards was indeed a defender of revivals, but most of the time it is in more in regards to a more conservative, moderate, tempered approach to revival. And what Winiarski seeks to do here is not necessarily revise that understanding of Edwards, but to show that that's not the full picture. That prior to his major treaties on revival, like Religious Affections, Edwards was very much a revival enthusiast, very much leaning more towards the radical and almost hyper charismatic side of the revivals for those days. In his article, Winiarski really is trying to ask one simple question. That is, why did sinners in the hands of an angry God, that is Edwards' magnum opus, his pinnacle revival sermon, that is probably the greatest sermon in American history, as far as at least most known American sermon in American history, why did it provoke the powerful and extreme revival response that it did? And what Winiarski does in his article is he uses a letter from a person that was in attendance there at the infield revivals. And he argues that Edwards' choice of preaching sinners was no mere just, hey, he got lucky, or, God just used him with this random sermon that he had. But the specific sermon that Edwards chose to preach that day was a very calculated decision in doing so. That the context, the events that were happening that led up to it, all of that had something to do to shape Edwards' message. Not only the words that he preached, but also the way that he preached it, and to the audience that he preached it. All of those things served to work together in this calculated sermon, which Edwards believed would bring further revival to the infield area. In his article, Winiarski really starts going out and laying out much of the prelude. And he talks about how Edwards wasn't even an original person to speak on the ticket. Originally, Edwards was merely a fill-in, and was, so after someone dropped out, Edwards took his place. And throughout the week, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, all of these revivals were being preached. These great itinerant preachers were preaching. People were having the same emotional responses, the shrieking, the crying, the laying prostrate on the floor. You name it, all of that was happening. And then Wednesday comes, and it's time for Edwards to preach. And all of this revival, all of these other revivals that have happened in the regions around, have served Edwards in a way of him knowing what words need to be spoken, what will truly drive these people to revival, to this same response that he has been so longing for in what he has believed has grown to be a cold and dull American church. Winiarski writes, the simple fact that shrieks and cries erupted well before Edwards completed his sermon, indeed the amazing cacophony actually prevented him from finishing his address, suggests that the people who packed the infield meeting house were primed for a dramatic preaching performance, and they knew what to do when they heard one. Edwards merely gave the people what they so earnestly desired. In other words, these people knew how to act. They knew what the response was all about. This was a movement, and they were very much a part of the movement. And the movement had its own actions, it had its own style, it had its own culture, it had its own context. And Edwards knew the message that would drive that movement forward and further. So the question has to be asked is, well, was Edwards merely an opportunist? Was he merely someone who just saw a thing that, hey, I was not a guy even on the first ticket, and they didn't necessarily want me to preach, and I got my opportunity, so I better make the most of it. So what is the most, what can I pick and pull from everyone else that I see is getting all of the good responses, and how can I mesh them into this one sermon? Was he merely an opportunist, just trying to jump on a bandwagon and be a part of this movement? And I want to answer that question with both a yes and a not quite. A yes and a not quite. Well, first, what I mean by yes. And I looked at this doing some research through, I believe, three great biographies regarding Edwards. The one by McDermott, others by D.G. Hart, and then the pinnacle biography done by George Marsden, and kind of giving us some further insight. And so, yes, Edwards was a opportunist, but he was an opportunist because he had a heart for revival. I love what McDermott wrote. If there were a gene for revival, Edwards surely had it. From his father Timothy, Edwards learned how to become a great preacher, to be ambitious and learned theologian. From his maternal grandfather, Solomon Starter, we read about him this week. Edwards gained an ineffable revivalist zeal. Edwards wrote to Josiah Wheeler, a secretary of the Massachusetts province, "I cannot hope that God is about to accomplish glorious things for his church, which makes me the more desirous of knowing as fully as may be the present state of religion in all the world." In other words, Edwards was very much an opportunist, but not because he wanted to be famous, not because he was just like he wanted people to think, wow, this guy's really got it, or he wanted to sell above the other preachers. No, Edwards had a heart for revival. He had saw what he believed was a cold and lifeless church. And so any way place that he could get on the bandwagon where he believed God was moving, which he very much did, we'll see in a second, he wanted to be there. And so if there was an opportunity for him to preach and be a part of what he believed God was at work doing in the Americas, he was going to take the opportunity and he was going to make the most of the opportunity. And seeing this great passion of young people pouring to it, having this great new birth experience, they believed, which made them more holy, more desirous, and longing for more of God. Edwards wrote to Deacon Lyman of Yale exactly his thoughts about revival. Edwards wrote, "There are clear and incontestable evidences that this is a true divine work. And if this be not the work of God, I have all my religion to learn over again, and know not what use to make my Bible." In other words, Edwards really believed this revival. He didn't believe it was his preaching or any of those other preachers before him. He didn't believe this context was merely the emotionalism of people. He believed it was a real work of God. And he stood by that throughout his life. And he was such a passionate believer. So, yes, he was an opportunist, but not quite in the way that we would often think of. He wasn't doing it for his own personal fame. He simply wanted to be where he believed God was at work. But what happened to this enthusiastic, almost hyper Calvin or hyper charismatic, revivalist thinker that was setting up meeting rooms where young people would go and have further emotional experiences and these affectionate experiences of God? What caused him to be a moderate? That is the question that really Winiarski leaves us with. And in many ways, many of the great biographers leave us with as well. As I put my bibliography up here, I just want to explain further what I mean by this. As we, as historians, begin researching and studying further into Jonathan Edwards, this great American theologian, this provides a great place for further exploration. What drove this almost hyper-charismatic leader of the revivals to being much more a temperate, moderate, conservative person who loved revival but wanted to really be discerning in what truly was revival and what wasn't? Was it his defense of revival against the old lights, men like Ebenezer Gay and Charles Chauncey, and trying to make revival as much palatable as possible to these old lights? Was it his own personal growth and development as a theologian, where he began to solve some of the errors in his ways, some of the perversions that came out of some of that revivalism? Was it a self-correction for him as he became more moderate? That question isn't fully answered, and it provides a great place for us to study further as we think about the great American theologian, Jonathan Edwards. God bless. Have a great day.